Most empaths never expect the hardest chapter of their life to become the very thing that prepares them for their greatest comeback. When you're in the middle of emotional exhaustion, betrayal, disappointment, or loss, it rarely feels like preparation. It feels like punishment. It feels like something has gone wrong. It feels as if life has singled you out and handed you more than you can carry. But if you study human psychology closely, you'll notice something fascinating. Growth almost never arrives wrapped in comfort. The most significant transformations tend to begin with disruption. Before a person's perspective changes, something usually has to challenge the way they've been seeing the world. Before someone develops real strength, they often have to encounter circumstances that reveal where they are vulnerable. For many empaths, this disruption comes through relationships. They give their trust and receive betrayal. They offer loyalty and encounter deception. They invest their energy into people who seem to appreciate them, only to discover that appreciation was conditional. Over time, these experiences create emotional fatigue. The empath begins questioning themselves. They wonder whether they were too trusting, too forgiving, too patient, or simply too hopeful. What makes this especially difficult is that empaths naturally search for understanding. When someone hurts them, their first instinct is often not to protect themselves. Their first instinct is to understand the other person's pain, motives, and struggles. While empathy is a remarkable strength, it can also become a trap when it prevents someone from recognizing reality. And reality is this: not everyone deserves unlimited access to your energy. Many empaths spend years learning that lesson. The challenge is that these painful experiences often feel meaningless while they've spread. In the moment, all you can see is the loss. You see the relationship ending. You see the opportunity disappearing. You see the disappointment. You see the rejection. What you don't see is the invisible work taking place beneath the surface. Psychologists often talk about adaptation. Human beings have an extraordinary ability to evolve in response to adversity. What initially feels unbearable gradually becomes manageable. What once devastated you eventually becomes something you can discuss with clarity and perspective. The event itself may not change, but you change. And that change matters. Because every difficult experience leaves behind a lesson, whether you consciously recognize it or not. Every betrayal teaches discernment. Every disappointment teaches resilience. Every setback teaches patience. Every loss teaches perspective. The empath who emerges from hardship is not the same person who entered it. This is why some of the strongest people you'll ever meet are those who have suffered deeply. They aren't strong because pain is desirable. They're strong because pain forced them to develop qualities they otherwise might never have discovered. Think about it for a moment. Confidence that has never been tested is merely optimism. Wisdom that has never encountered difficulty is merely information. Strength that has never faced resistance is merely potential. Real confidence, real wisdom, and real strength are forged through experience. And this is where many empaths are standing right now, even if they don't realize it. They think they're recovering from a difficult chapter. In reality, they're being prepared for a completely different version of themselves. The version that no longer ignores red flags. The version that no longer confuses self-sacrifice with love. The version that understands boundaries are not walls, they're acts of self-respect. The version that knows their value does not depend on being needed by everyone around them. The breakdown wasn't proof that they were weak. The breakdown was the process that revealed where their strength needed to be built. History is filled with examples of people who experienced tremendous setbacks before achieving their greatest successes. Philosophers have long observed that adversity has a unique ability to strip away illusions. It removes what is superficial and forces us to confront what is essential. For the empath, that process can be uncomfortable because so much of their identity has often been tied to helping others. But eventually a moment arrives when they begin asking a different question. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they begin asking, "What is this teaching me?" That single shift changes everything. Because the moment you start searching for meaning instead of merely searching for relief, growth accelerates. You stop seeing yourself as a victim of circumstances and begin seeing yourself as a student of experience. And that's when the comeback truly begins. Not when the pain disappears. Not when life suddenly becomes easy. Not when everyone finally understands your worth. The comeback begins the moment you realize that everything you survived was building the person you're becoming. Remember this. The darkest chapter of your story may not be evidence that you are falling apart. It may be evidence that you're being prepared for something greater than you. Once an empath begins to understand that their hardships were not meaningless, a second realization starts to emerge. This realization is often uncomfortable because it requires an honest look at patterns that may have existed for years. It requires asking a difficult question. Where has all of my energy been going? For many empaths, the answer is startling. A tremendous amount of their emotional energy has been invested in people who never intended to reciprocate it. This doesn't happen because empaths are weak. It happens because one of their greatest strengths can become one of their greatest vulnerabilities. They possess an unusual ability to see potential in others. They can often recognize goodness beneath insecurity, pain beneath anger, and fear beneath destructive behavior. While this ability allows them to connect deeply with people, it can also lead them into relationships that are fundamentally unbalanced. They see who someone could become rather than who that person consistently chooses to be. Psychologically speaking, this is one of the most common traps highly empathetic individuals fall into. They become attached to possibilities rather than realities. They continue investing effort because they believe their patience, understanding, or love will eventually produce change. Sometimes it does, but often it doesn't. The difficult truth is that no amount of compassion can transform someone who has no intention of transforming themselves. Many empaths spend years carrying emotional responsibilities that were never theirs to carry. They become the problem solver, the peacemaker, the rescuer, the emotional caretaker. Whenever conflict appears, they step in. Whenever someone is struggling, they offer support. Whenever a relationship begins to fracture, they work tirelessly to repair it. At first, this behavior can feel noble. It can feel like kindness. It can feel like love. But there comes a point where helping becomes enabling. There comes a point where giving becomes self-neglect. There comes a point where loyalty becomes a refusal to acknowledge reality. This is where many empaths find themselves exhausted, not because they lack strength, but because they have been distributing their strength without limits. Human energy is not infinite. Attention is not infinite. Emotional resources are not infinite. Every time you invest deeply in someone who consistently drains you, you are withdrawing resources from your own growth, your own healing, and your own future. What's fascinating is that many empaths don't recognize this immediately because they have developed a subtle association between being needed and being valuable. When people depend on them, they feel important. When people seek their support, they feel useful. When people praise their generosity, they feel appreciated. There is nothing inherently wrong with these experiences. The problem emerges when self-worth becomes dependent on them. Because eventually, the empath begins giving not because they genuinely want to, but because they fear what will happen if they stop. They fear disappointing people. They fear being misunderstood. They fear appearing selfish. They fear losing relationships. And so, they continue pouring from a cup that is already empty. The irony is that many of the people benefiting from this dynamic never truly appreciate the cost. They become accustomed to receiving support without considering the sacrifice behind it. What was once viewed as generosity becomes expected. What was once appreciated becomes taken for granted. This is often the moment that awakens the empath. Not because they suddenly become cold, not because they stop caring, but because they finally recognize a fundamental truth. Healthy relationships require mutual investment. Respect cannot exist where one person consistently gives and the other consistently takes. Genuine connection cannot flourish where one person's needs always outweigh the other's. Balance is not selfish. Balance is necessary. This realization marks the beginning of a profound shift. Instead of asking, "How can I save everyone around me?" the empath begins asking, "Who is investing in me the way I invest in them?" That question changes everything. Because it redirects attention towards something many empaths have neglected for years, themselves. They begin protecting their time. They begin protecting their peace. They begin paying attention to how people make them feel rather than focusing exclusively on how they make others feel. And perhaps most importantly, they begin understanding that compassion and boundaries are not opposites. In fact, healthy boundaries are what allow compassion to remain sustainable. Without boundaries, empathy becomes exhaustion. Without boundaries, kindness becomes obligation. Without boundaries, generosity becomes self-destruction. The strongest version of an empath is not the person who gives endlessly. The strongest version is the person who gives intentionally. Someone who understands that their energy is valuable. Someone who recognizes that access to their emotional world must be earned, not assumed. Someone who realizes that protecting their well-being is not an act of selfishness. It is an act of wisdom. And once an empath learns this lesson, something remarkable happens. The energy that was once scattered across people who never valued it begins returning home. It becomes available for healing, growth, purpose, and transformation. That's when life starts changing. Because the moment you stop pouring your future into the wrong people, you finally have enough left to invest in yourself. Once an empath stops pouring endless amounts of energy into the wrong people, something unexpected begins to happen. For the first time in a long time, they are left alone with themselves. And initially, that can feel uncomfortable. When you've spent years focusing on other people's emotions, solving other people's problems, and carrying other people's burdens, turning your attention inward can feel unfamiliar. There is no crisis to manage, no one to rescue, no relationship demanding all of your emotional resources. What remains is a question that many empaths have avoided asking for years. Who am I when I stop defining myself by what I do for others? This question marks the beginning of one of the most important transformations an empath can experience. Because underneath every disappointment, every betrayal, every rejection, and every heartbreak, there is often an opportunity hidden in plain sight. The opportunity is not simply to recover. The opportunity is to discover a deeper understanding of your own value. Most people assume confidence comes from success. They believe confidence is built when life goes according to plan, when relationships work out, when goals are achieved, and when other people recognize their worth. But psychology tells us something different. Some of the strongest forms of confidence are born through adversity. When a person survives experiences they once believed would break them, something changes inside them. They begin to gather evidence that they are more resilient than they imagined. This is particularly true for empaths. For years, many empaths measure their worth through external responses. They feel valuable when they are appreciated. They feel secure when they are needed. They feel significant when they are helping someone heal or overcome a challenge. While those experiences can be meaningful, they create a dangerous dependency when self-worth becomes tied entirely to how others respond. Because eventually, someone fails to appreciate the effort. Someone takes advantage of the kindness. Someone walks away despite receiving the love. Someone chooses not to see the value that was standing in front of them. And when that happens, the empath faces a crossroads. One path leads towards self-doubt. The other leads towards self-discovery. The first path sounds familiar to many people. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I should have done more. Maybe I should have tried harder. Maybe something is wrong with me. These thoughts can become incredibly persuasive after emotional pain. The human mind naturally searches for explanations, and unfortunately, it often turns inward when relationships fail. But there is another possibility. What if the rejection was not evidence of your inadequacy? What if it was evidence of incompatibility? What if someone failing to recognize your value says more about their perception than your worth? This shift in perspective is powerful because it separates identity from outcome. A healthy sense of self-worth cannot depend entirely on external approval. If it does, your confidence will always be controlled by forces outside your influence. It will rise when people praise you and collapse when they criticize you. Real confidence operates differently. Real confidence is built when you understand your value, regardless of who recognizes it. Think about how gold remains valuable, whether someone appreciates it or not. Its worth does not fluctuate based on opinion. Human beings are not objects, of course, but the principle is similar. Your value does not disappear simply because someone failed to acknowledge it. The empath's challenge is learning to internalize this truth. And often, pain becomes the teacher. Heartbreak teaches discernment. Rejection teaches independence. Disappointment teaches emotional self-reliance. Loss teaches perspective. Experiences that initially appear destructive often reveal strengths that would have remained hidden otherwise. This is one reason adversity can become such a powerful catalyst for growth. It forces a confrontation with reality. It strips away illusions. It exposes patterns that were previously invisible. Many empaths eventually realize that they were seeking permission to value themselves. They were waiting for appreciation, waiting for validation, waiting for recognition, waiting for someone else to confirm what they should have known all along. The breakthrough occurs when that waiting ends, when the empath stops asking others to define their worth and begins defining it themselves. That doesn't mean becoming arrogant. It doesn't mean believing you're better than others. It means recognizing that your value is inherent, not conditional. You don't become valuable because someone loves you. You don't become valuable because someone stays. You don't become valuable because someone chooses you. You were valuable before any of those things happened, and you remain valuable if none of them do. This realization changes the way an empath moves through the world. They stop shrinking themselves to make others comfortable. They stop apologizing for having needs. They stop sacrificing their well-being to earn acceptance. They stop viewing boundaries as barriers and begin seeing them as standards. Most importantly, they begin trusting themselves, not because they are perfect, not because they never make mistakes, but because they have survived enough to know they can handle whatever comes next. This is where pain transforms into power, not because suffering is desirable, not because hardship is necessary for everyone, but because when adversity is met with awareness, reflection, and growth, it can produce wisdom that comfort never could. The experiences that once felt like evidence of your weakness become proof of your resilience. The wounds that once defined your story become reminders of how far you've come. And the challenges that once made you question your worth become the very things that reveal it. Remember this: your greatest power begins the moment you stop asking the world to tell you who you are and start deciding that for yourself. Once an empath begins to reclaim their worth, another phase of transformation often appears. It's a phase that many people misunderstand, both from the outside and from within. It is the season of silence. This is the period when an empath starts pulling back from the noise. They become less interested in constant social validation. They stop explaining themselves to everyone. They become more selective about where they invest their time, attention, and emotional energy. To the outside world, this can look like withdrawal. Some people assume the empath is becoming distant. Others assume they are bitter, hurt, or emotionally unavailable. But what is actually happening is far more significant. They are rebuilding. One of the most overlooked truths in psychology is that growth often requires separation. Before a person can clearly understand who they are, they must create enough distance from the influences that have been shaping them. Think about how difficult it is to hear your own thoughts in a crowded room. The same principle applies psychologically. If your mind is constantly occupied by other people's expectations, opinions, demands, and emotions, it becomes nearly impossible to hear your own inner voice. Many empaths spend years living in that crowded room. They become so accustomed to monitoring everyone else's emotional state that they gradually lose touch with their own. Their decisions become influenced by how others will react. Their boundaries become determined by how others will feel. Their priorities become shaped by external demands rather than internal convictions. Eventually, however, something changes. The empath becomes tired of abandoning themselves, not because they stop caring about people, but because they finally realize that caring about others should not require neglecting themselves. This realization often initiates a period of solitude, and solitude is very different from loneliness. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection. Solitude is the practice of reconnection. During this phase, the empath begins learning things about themselves that could never be discovered while they were constantly focused on everyone else. They begin noticing their genuine preferences, values, interests, and goals. They begin identifying which beliefs truly belong to them and which were inherited from the expectations of others. At first, this process can feel unsettling. Without constant distractions, unresolved emotions begin to surface. Old disappointments reappear. Memories that were pushed aside demand attention. Regrets, frustrations, and fears rise into awareness. Many people avoid this stage because it is uncomfortable. But discomfort is often a sign that meaningful work is taking place. Psychologists understand that avoidance provides temporary relief but rarely produces long-term growth. Healing requires engagement. It requires sitting with difficult emotions long enough to understand them rather than running from them. The empath who enters this season of silence begins doing exactly that. Instead of distracting themselves, they reflect. Instead of reacting impulsively, they observe. Instead of seeking answers from everyone around them, they begin searching within. And this changes something fundamental. They develop discernment. Discernment is different from judgment. Judgment quickly labels people and situations. Discernment carefully evaluates them. A younger version of the empath may have ignored warning signs because they wanted to see the best in everyone. They may have confused potential with reality. They may have tolerated behavior that violated their values because they hoped things would improve. But silence creates clarity. When emotional noise decreases, patterns become easier to recognize. The empath begins noticing who consistently respects boundaries and who consistently ignores them. They notice who supports their growth and who only benefits from their generosity. They notice which relationships create peace and which create chaos. This awareness is not cynicism, it is wisdom. And wisdom is one of the greatest gifts this quiet season provides. Another important shift occurs during this period. The empath begins developing emotional independence. For years, they may have relied on external reassurance to feel secure. They may have looked to relationships, approval, or validation as sources of stability. But now, they begin discovering something more reliable: themselves. They learn that peace does not come from controlling circumstances. It comes from regulating their response to circumstances. They learn that confidence is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the willingness to move forward despite uncertainty. They learn that strength is not emotional suppression. It is emotional mastery. This is why some of the strongest people become quieter as they grow. Not because they have less to say, but because they no longer feel compelled to prove themselves. They become comfortable with who they are, comfortable with their values, comfortable with their boundaries, comfortable with their purpose. And that comfort creates a presence that is far more powerful than constant explanation ever could be. The season of silence is not a pause in the comeback. It is the foundation of the comeback. It is where emotional wounds become wisdom. It is where confusion becomes clarity. It is where self-doubt is gradually replaced by self-trust. Most importantly, it is where the empath stops seeking permission to become who they were meant to be. If you find yourself in a quieter season right now, don't mistake it for stagnation. Don't assume nothing is happening simply because the progress isn't visible. Some of the most important transformations occur beneath the surface, where no one else can see them. Remember this: the strongest version of you is not being built in the spotlight. It is being built in the moments of reflection, solitude, and truth that no one else witnesses. After everything we've discussed, the hardships that shaped you, the energy you reclaimed, the worth you rediscovered, and the wisdom developed during your season of silence, we arrive at the moment that many empaths spend years moving toward without fully realizing it. The comeback. Not the kind of comeback most people imagine. Not a dramatic moment where everything suddenly becomes perfect. Not a day when every problem disappears. Not a moment when the people who hurt you finally understand what they lost. The real comeback is much deeper than that. It is the moment you become someone who no longer needs those things in order to move forward. This is where the empath's transformation reaches its most powerful stage, because the person standing here now is fundamentally different from the person who began this journey. The earlier version of the empath often looked outward for direction. They sought validation from relationships, reassurance from others, and confirmation that they were on the right path. Their emotional state was frequently influenced by the behavior, opinions, and choices of people around them. But experience has changed that. Not overnight, not easily, but permanently. Through hardship, the empath has learned something that cannot be taught in a classroom, and cannot be acquired through theory alone. They have learned the value of self-trust. And self-trust changes everything. When you trust yourself, you stop second-guessing every decision. You stop abandoning your instincts simply because someone else disagrees. You stop ignoring your intuition when something feels wrong. You stop negotiating with red flags that you clearly recognize. For years, many empaths possess extraordinary intuition but fail to honor it. They sense dishonesty before evidence appears. They feel imbalance before it becomes obvious. They recognize unhealthy dynamics long before they fully reveal themselves. Yet, they often talk themselves out of what they know. They give endless second chances. They rationalize behavior. They doubt their own perceptions. But the comeback changes that. The empath begins treating their intuition as information rather than inconvenience. They begin trusting what experience has taught them, and because of that, they move through life differently. They become more intentional, more focused, more selective, not because they have become less compassionate, but because they have become wiser about where compassion belongs. One of the most profound shifts during this stage is that the empath no longer feels compelled to chase acceptance. This may sound simple, but psychologically it represents a major breakthrough. Many people spend enormous portions of their lives attempting to manage how others perceive them. They adjust their behavior to gain approval. They suppress parts of themselves to avoid criticism. They shape their identity around external expectations. Empaths are particularly vulnerable to this pattern because they naturally notice emotional reactions in others. But eventually, a realization emerges. No matter how kind you are, someone will misunderstand you. No matter how generous you are, someone will criticize you. No matter how much you give, someone will want more. The pursuit of universal approval is unwinnable. And once the empath accepts this reality, a tremendous amount of energy becomes available. Energy that was previously spent managing perceptions can now be invested in purpose. Purpose becomes increasingly important during the comeback phase because healing naturally creates space for something new. Nature rarely tolerates emptiness. When old wounds begin closing, new possibilities begin opening. The empath starts asking different questions. What do I want to build? What kind of life do I want to create? What gifts have I been neglecting? What purpose has been waiting beneath all this survival? These questions redirect attention away from the past and toward the future. And that is where genuine momentum begins. Because a comeback is not simply about recovering from what happened. It is about becoming something greater because of what happened. The strongest empaths eventually understand that their sensitivity was never their weakness. It was their strength without boundaries. Their compassion was never the problem. It simply needed wisdom to guide it. Their emotional depth was never something to overcome. It was something to refine. What once felt like a burden becomes an advantage. They read people more accurately. They connect more authentically. They make decisions with greater awareness. They understand human nature at a deeper level. Most importantly, they stop apologizing for the very qualities that make them unique. There is a quiet confidence that emerges at this stage. Not arrogance, not superiority. Confidence, the kind that comes from surviving experiences that once seemed impossible. The kind that comes from rebuilding yourself after disappointment. The kind that comes from discovering that your strength was present even when you believed it wasn't. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The comeback was never about becoming someone entirely new. It was about uncovering the person who was there all along beneath the fear, the doubt, the exhaustion, and the pain. The resilient person, the wise person, the capable person, the powerful person. The version of you that life has been preparing through every challenge you've faced. So if you're standing at the edge of a new chapter, wondering whether you're ready, understand this. You do not need more proof. You do not need perfect conditions. You do not need everyone's approval. You only need the courage to trust what your journey has already taught you. Because the greatest comeback of your life begins the moment you stop looking back at who hurt you and start moving forward as the person they never thought you would become.